Welcome to Restaurant Influencers, presented by Entrepreneur. I am your host, Sean Walchef. This is a Cali BBQ Media production. In life, in the restaurant business, and in the new creator economy, we learn through lessons and stories. I am so grateful to Toast, our primary technology partner, for believing in storytelling in the hospitality space and giving us the platform and the opportunity to have conversations like we get to have today. I have to pinch myself because this is an incredible opportunity. We have Mayim Bialik, and she is a mom. She's an actor. She's a director. She's a host. She is a PhD in neuroscience. She is known for her roles in Blossom, Big Bang Theory, a Jeopardy host. And what we're here to talk about today is the amazing work that she is doing with the Bialik Breakdown, her podcast that she is so graciously publishing all over the internet to help so many people get vulnerable, learn from vulnerability, learn about mental health. Mayim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Where in the world is your favorite stadium, stage, or venue?
To perform or to see things?
To perform.
Oh gosh. The sweeter answer is like in my car with my kids, where I think I'm actually often the funniest. Most of my life, I live on a soundstage. So, it's kind of an interesting question. But I'm kind of funny in my car with my kids.
Give me a stage, a more intimate stage, something where you'd be giving a speech. A venue, maybe.
Yeah, no, for sure. I've spoken at universities all over the country and all over North America and even other places in the world. I really love speaking, I love speaking in kind of college environments, especially when you pull both like faculty and students and members of the larger community. I do a lot of public speaking. For the podcast, my podcasting partner, Jonathan, and we were just at South by, and we had, a packed room of people really excited to learn about our podcast and science and spirituality. And that was a really special kind of venue too. So.
Beautiful. Let's go back to South by for this audience. And I would love for you to share your podcasting journey, specifically why you started the show, where did the idea come from, and the lessons that you've learned along the way.
Yeah. So, at the time that I was thinking about, trying to do more as a science educator, I'm really trained as a science communicator. I have a doctorate in neuroscience, but I'm, specifically someone who really likes to explain things, maybe to people who don't have a background in science. And I actually designed a neuroscience curriculum when I was out of grad school for junior high and high schoolers in the homeschool community here in Los Angeles. And so I love, talking about science, and originally thought of like, gosh, should I do a talk show where we talk all about science? And it was my partner, Jonathan, who was like, no, you should do a podcast. And I said, well, I've never listened to one. What's a podcast? And it was, really COVID hit, and then the lockdown happened, and we were thinking like, how are we going to do this? And we ended up, turning the house that I used to live in, which had been rented for years, and the person who had rented it had just moved out. And so we turned that house into a podcast studio. And, a lot of the producing really, goes to my partner, Jonathan. He much more has the brain for that. He also is a co-founder of a startup company. So he knows about workflow and all those things. And, I really kind of took hold of the content, side of it. And when we started, we really wanted to democratize mental health. We figured, gosh, if people like him and me, who had a history of having access to therapy and to healing and managing anxiety, like if we were struggling, imagine people who had no vocabulary for what they were even experiencing when there was a global pandemic. And so that's really was our motivation, was like, let's just explain to people, like, if you're having trouble sleeping, if you're having trouble, eating, if you're thinking about the future, like this is called anxiety if you don't know. And for those of us who know, we're happy to tell you what works and what doesn't. And, um, so anyway, that's sort of how the podcast started, was much more informational. And then we started having some pretty awesome guests on, and we found that people really wanted to be vulnerable and felt like opening up to me in particular. And we found that there were some themes that kept running through the episodes, and we sort of kind of kept shifting the podcast to adapt to what we were hearing. And, where we've kind of landed and what we ended up talking about at South by Southwest was like, mind, body, and spirit. They're all connected in some way, and each component is critical for the health of the other systems. So, having a relationship to something greater than yourself actually helps your physiological wellness. It helps your emotional wellness, and we talk about the science of why that is, and that's sort of where our podcast has evolved to. But we have incredible guests, who want to come on and talk about their stories, and incredible experts, who are helping us explain these things.
Choosing to be vulnerable. As a host, the reason why I'm taking a big assumption here, that the guests feel okay to open up on your show is that you lead with vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of it like that, but apparently that seems to be like, people feel comfortable when there's a place of comfort. And we do, Jonathan and I both speak very openly about our history with mental health challenges and what's worked and what hasn't worked, and also that we're still works in progress. There's a lot of, especially celebrity platforms out there that will tell you like how to fix it. Here's what I did. Like, I look great on the cover of People magazine because like everything's great. And that's kind of not our vibe. Our vibe is like, wow, every week in your life has some complexity or thing with your kid or with your boss. And, like you get to keep practicing all these things, and there's not really like a destination per se, but there's a journey, that we're all on. And like, what are the resources and what are the tools that we can have that make it, a little bit easier? But there's no cure for being human, and it's true. Once you kind of start from there, I think people do feel more comfortable, joining you there.
So you had a quote in Vanity Fair and they asked you, is there anything you won't share? And you said, there's a whole part of my life that's just mine. A lot of things are left on the cutting room floor. My kids don't listen to the podcast. They barely listen to me when they have to. I humiliate myself all the time on TikTok. So podcast is probably the least embarrassing thing that I do.
Yeah, I mean, my kids might disagree with that also. Yeah, I mean, I think what's true is, while there are things that I don't necessarily, go into great detail about, and I do try and leave a lot of my kids', life and identity and experiences. And I think for the most part, I leave that sort of out of it. The fact is, what you're not getting an inauthentic version of me, just because you're not getting a 101% version of me. What I show on the podcast is pretty accurate to what it's like. And then, yeah, there's other parts that necessarily don't get shared the same way.
What have you learned in the podcasting journey as far as publishing cadence? How many episodes are you putting out? The format?
Yeah. I mean, I've learned that I don't know a lot. And, when I try and figure it out, I often still need a lot of help, having it, processed for me and with me. I a lot of times, think that someone doesn't like me, and it turns out they do, so I've learned not to trust my first instinct of like, is this going well? Like, what's happening here? And also editing can save a lot, meaning if I'm feeling awkward or if I make a mistake, that stuff, it can feel like it'll flow a little bit better with editing, but we're not a highly edited show that way. We're a 4-camera show, which is unusual in that, about 1.5 million, subscribers on YouTube, get to see us, or anybody who wants to subscribe can see us. So that's, heavier on the editing, but, it really makes a difference when people know they can count on you once a week. That's a thing. It really makes a difference. With very few exceptions, we put out an episode a week. We do sometimes have, 2 things in a week. Sometimes we'll drop something in there. This is much more Jonathan and our producer, Valerie Floyd's, kind of, they do a lot of testing and, seeing what might work and what can help. But people like novel content when we post it, which kind of surprised me. Like I once did a guided meditation thing and like people loved it. Or I started using the 10% Happier app, which like they're not paying me to say that. It's Dan Harris's, meditation app. And, I basically kept like a little video journal and people really like that. And so you never know what people will like. Jonathan and I will do lives sometimes. I played the piano. I played Matisyahu's One Day and people like lost their minds. Like, I didn't know you played piano. I didn't know you sang. So I think like, really being open to trying stuff out has been important. I'll always second guess myself. I'll always have the reason not to do it. And so it's really helpful to have, in particular, Jonathan as a real cheerleader. He really he thinks people really will get a lot out of a lot of the things that I'm afraid to try. So I'm really lucky to have a partner. I mean, he's much more in that sort of like, let's try it out space. He has an MFA in screenwriting. So he's a creative in ways that I can be a lot more stringent with myself creatively.
You said 4 camera setup, is that right?
Yeah.
So are you in the same are you still producing in the same studio from COVID?
No, it's literally it's where the bedroom that I used to
That's so awesome.
And it's a small space, but yeah, we have, the ability for 2 different size singles and then a shot of Jonathan. And then we have a 2-shot. And then he's remote, for part of the time. And so we have a whole setup for a monitor to make it, at least so that I feel like I can talk to him. And that if we have a guest, I'm not being pulled too many directions. So yeah, it's a pretty small space. We used to be at 2 desks. And this is one of the things I was like, I think we need to be at 1 desk. And Jonathan said, no, we need 2 desks. And then finally he gave in after, I don't know, a year or so. And now we're at 1 desk.
And now a quick break from restaurant influencers to welcome our newest sponsor to the show. It's Zach Oates, the founder of Ovation.
Ovation is helping restaurants to improve operations with the human touch. We are a guest experience platform for multi-unit restaurants like Friendly's, Muya, PDQ, Taziki's, and even Cali Barbecue, with thousands of others that starts with a 2-question survey and drives revenue, location level improvement, and guest recovery. So here's how it works. The guest answers 2 questions. The first one is, how was your experience? And then from there, happy guests are invited to do things that are going to drive revenue, and unhappy guests share privately what went wrong, so you and your team can resolve that concern in real time. Our AI will even help you do that. Then the magic happens. We take all the public reviews, we take all the Ovation feedback, we categorize it using our AI, and give you detailed feedback in 34 restaurant-specific categories to improve your operations. So we make sure that guests feel good, that you look good. And if you're interested in learning more, visit ovationup.com/Sean, because any listener of Sean's is a friend of Ovation's.
When you first started, you said you didn't know about the podcasting space. Once you started getting going, did you start to follow any other shows that you admired up to?
There's definitely people kind of in our space that I don't regularly listen to. It's just not part of my brain just sort of doesn't work in the listening to podcast space. I also don't watch television though, and there's a couple shows that I have watched in the last 20 years, but that's not really how I consume information best, I guess. I read a lot more than I listen or watch. But there's definitely people like Jay Shetty and like Huberman and Atiya and those kind of people. Jonathan loves Kara Swisher, like he's really big with her, and like Scott Galloway, and so there's different things. Sometimes it's format, sometimes it's content. For me in sort of the mental health space, like there's a lot of people in that space. There weren't when we started. And so now it's kind of like hard to sift through. But yeah, Valerie and Jonathan also do a lot of that kind of stuff. But it's clear that people are getting more flashy with their advertising. People are using AI. People are, doing a lot more to be seen in this space. And I understand the need for that. I just personally don't have a brain for kind of tackling it so much. But, it's my job to try things out, and that I can do.
How have you learned the process of interviewing, the craft of interviewing?
It's still a process. Sometimes I talk too much about myself, especially if someone's really quiet. I just have that like anxious need to fill space, which I'm trying to learn to just like chill out about. Jonathan has to keep reminding me, like, we can edit. Like, if they're quiet and they need a minute, like, it's okay. It'll all come together. I think it's important to really let the guests shine, and to find the places for them to really feel like they have space to have their platform. I was recently interviewed by Taylor Lautner and his wife for their podcast, and it was really weird because I'm not used to being interviewed like that, on a podcast about mental health, and I was like, this is uncomfortable. Why do people do that? And then I realized, like, oh, that's because
I do that.
Right. And also, like, I wasn't used to it. I wasn't used to being on someone else's podcast where they said, wow, tell us about eating disorders and tell us about alcoholism and tell us about all these things. So yeah, I think it's also important to let people know who they are. Meaning, I would never, I would never like just kiss someone's butt just to make them feel comfortable. But I do want people to know, because I do read people's books when they come on. I do, Valerie does research, and I'm the one who reads the books. Like Jonathan says, we put the information in the computer and the computer spits out what we need to know. So I am a fast reader. And it's important to me for people to know, like, I really appreciated this about your book, or this touched me, or, to let them know that they mattered enough to me before they were sitting in front of me, for us to have a conversation. And also, I do think it's important to have some levity. We have like a rapid fire that we do. And I'm very curious in how people got to where they are. Sometimes people are less interested in that, but I've also found that it's a really good icebreaker because it lets people kind of like, lets people sort of talk about the things about us that we often forget that make us who we are. I remember when we had Joe Dispenza on, I was like, where'd you grow up? Like, what's your life like? How do you become Joe Dispenza? Like, what's going on in there? And he was actually pretty open to it. And I was like, oh, he's like a dude I think he's from New Jersey. I was like, oh, he's like a guy. And then he becomes Joe Dispenza, right? But I'm really interested in sort of like what anchors people to other people. Like, how is Matthew McConaughey's story not very different from, the person who reads auras, right? How's Dustin Hoffman and Ben Stiller's story not that different from, Sarah Silverman's, or the lady who got struck by lightning and met God? Everybody's got a very, similar template. Like, we were all born somewhere and raised somewhere, and we pretty much all felt like either we didn't fit in, or something wasn't right, or if we had success, it wasn't enough, or it wasn't the right kind, or we didn't deserve it. So like, that's the human experience. So helping people find that, when you interview them, I think is important too.
Did you feel like you fit in San Diego? I'm from San Diego, and
no, I was actually, I left very early,
Yes.
but we go back because my grandparents lived there. And so, my grandparents fled the pogroms leading up to the Holocaust from Eastern Europe, and they lived like survivors. They lived in a community of survivors, and they didn't really speak English very well. So like, my San Diego experience was like a community that was like 3 blocks long of like everyone who spoke like my grandparents and had these like heavy Eastern European accents. And like, I would go to their synagogue, and I would go to the park, and then my parents would go to we'd go to Bazaar del Mundo, and they would have margaritas to recover from seeing my grandparents. Like, that was my San Diego experience. So I love, I have a strong identification with it, because like, we were living in my grandparents' living room when I was born. So like, that was a real refuge. My parents had just moved from New York. And but yeah, I definitely didn't feel like I fit in Los Angeles, because I was raised like a New Yorker in Los Angeles.
So I too, I was raised by my grandfather. I never met my father. He's from Bulgaria. And something that you had said in one of your interviews about cooking, specifically your grandmother. Can you share a little bit about why you're so passionate about cooking?
Yeah. I mean, someone was asking me the other day, like, I was cooking from the time I was like in preschool. I had my own set of pots and pans, and my mom, learning to wash dishes was like the first skill that I learned regarding cooking, because it's what my mom did. And we didn't have a dishwasher, till well later in my life. Maybe junior high or high school, so I grew up as a domestic, and having Eastern European grandparents meant that like, you were raised to sew and to cook and to clean. And like, it was also a thing of like pride. Like, it wasn't like, oh, we're our own housekeeper. It was like, these are the skills that I learned. And, my mom was a fantastic cook. And my grandmother was Hungarian. And so like, cooking was like, it was like that's like a national tradition, is like to cook. And, my grandmother, we would say like she could turn anything to gold, like whether it was food or like a piece of fabric or, she was just like this amazing, she was an artist, but like she was an artist who like never graduated elementary school and like was a sweatshop worker, but she was brilliant in the kitchen. And, people would tell stories like, oh, she made a goulash that I'll never forget, like it changed her life. But yeah, I was raised to cook and to bake. So those are skills that I still, have and use, and trying to teach my boys. It's a little harder to compete with the phone these days. When I was a kid, it was like either play alone in your room or come cook. So yeah, huge culinary, we didn't call it culinary. It was just like cooking, it was cooking and baking, and it was feeding people, and it was taking care of them. But also, raised in a, kind of traditional Jewish community, cooking is a huge cornerstone of our culture. Every holiday is about the food that represents the liberation or the struggle or the victory or the this, the that. We have fasting days, then we have like, how are we going to break the fast? It's like very important. And also spiritually significant. Our food often has spiritual meaning. And so, yeah, I published a cookbook called Mayim's Vegan Table. This was a million years ago when people were like, vegan, what's that? And so, I happen to have raised my kids vegan. They have hair and rosy cheeks, and they're, both very tall, taller than me. So, yeah, I did used to cook meat. It's been a minute. But yeah, that's sort of my cooking life.
Can you tell me more about the cooking content, about TikTok, YouTube, some of the stuff that
Yeah, people love to watch people cook, and I'm happy to cook. I really love doing, Instagram lives in particular where I cook. And sometimes it'll be spontaneous where I'm like, oh, I totally forgot I'm baking hamantaschen for this Jewish holiday. Like, let's talk about it. And yeah, I really I don't do it perfectly. I still haven't even figured out the best way to like rig the camera so that you can like see what I'm doing. But I cook like a real person, like I wipe my hands on my apron and sometimes on my face, and it's messy. It's not perfect. I have a lot of like I have a bunch of like my grandmother's bowls. I have like the rolling pin that my paternal grandmother, literally like someone brought it from Poland when they came over. And so like I have this like beautiful wood, like, classic Eastern European, rolling pin. So, I have a smattering of dishes. I don't have a full set of everything. I literally have like my mom's dishes that like she used, so like my kitchen looks like a normal person's kitchen, I would think. I mean, I have like open shelving and it's, very pretty, but a lot of the stuff on there is like mason jars and like weird, like, old olive jars that now hold flax seeds, and, it's like a real kitchen. So I think maybe that's what people like. I'm messy. I drop things. Like sometimes I burn things. Yeah.
From what we've found and doing the work that we do, talking to the people that are creating the best content, that have built audiences and, communities, people that actually buy in. Sam, the cooking guy, he's a close friend of mine, and he always talks about, if you don't like me on video, you're not going to like me in real life, because I'm the same person.
Pretty much. Like, I think I may have left some veggie broth on the stove while we've been doing this interview, and I'm starting to smell it. So
exactly right. Can you talk a little bit about your YouTube vlog? So you've put out some videos that have done really, really well, and videos that most people wouldn't think to be vulnerable, back to being vulnerable. Why I stopped having kids, 4 million views. Remembering wedding after my divorce, why I'm vegan. I mean, these are all topics that most people would probably steer away from.
Yeah, I started my YouTube channel because a friend of mine, his name's Emmanuel Shalev, and he was actually part of the Maccabeats, a group of a cappella singers that went viral many years ago when I was on Big Bang Theory. And he and I connected because he was much more skilled in the tech space, and he had gone viral as an a cappella group. Like, who does that, right? And we became very close friends, and he believed in me more than I believed in myself, which has been kind of the story of my whole career. And he said, you have a voice, you have a thing that people really love when you're vulnerable. And I believe that you can build an audience from this. And I was like, I don't even know what YouTube is. Like, what does that mean? And, he pointed me to people like Grace Helbig and, John and Hank Green, and people who were like making unusual kind of like geeky content. And I was like, oh, I have things to say. And it was, he was my first kind of editor, and we started this YouTube channel. And he literally, he pushed me to be vulnerable about things and really resonated with people. I've talked about science and God. I've talked about vaccines. Like I've talked about all those things. I've talked about extended breastfeeding. And and so that was kind of why we used the YouTube channel to sort of launch, the podcast, because in many ways it's an extension of that, it's an extension of that vulnerability. And really just kind of me being an authentic person. And I think there's a lot of people who will show you a shiny world and a world where everything gets, tied up. Like that's not what I do. It's not my life experience. It's not, I can't really pretend to be that. So I just get to be myself. And a lot of people do resonate with that.
Can you share a little bit about the other social platforms? Which one's your favorite digital playground?
Look, before October 7th, I really enjoyed TikTok, which is not to say I don't enjoy TikTok after October 7th, but, the situation with, the sort of attack on a lot of Jewish celebrities, really having nothing to do with politics. I am a bleeding heart liberal, and, have argued for the rights of Palestinians for decades. But that became a really difficult platform to exist on, just even with neutral content. And so that's been a challenge. Every platform has been a challenge for many of us who are prominent just for being Jewish, again, having nothing to do with politics. So it's been really hard. There's things that I love about really each of the platforms. I still love Facebook. I remember back in the day, that's actually where you would like share with people who really want to talk about stuff. So I have, I think everybody has their issues with different aspects of X and Instagram and all of them, so I have a really great, social media team that sort of helps do the actual posting, because as the kind of brain that I have, I will constantly get locked out of things, constantly forget my passwords. Everything changes. I get locked out. I don't understand what's a reel. So yeah.
How did you build the social media team? When did it start?
Actually my publicist, Heather Bezignano at Icon, it's a team that she's worked with. And so it's Amanda C, is her name. And, it's like real people, who understand also how to interact with me and help me, craft language. We used to do a lot more. I'm literally going to turn off the stove.
That is awesome. Oh, it's fantastic.
Totally. Like the fire alarm may go off because my broth.
We don't want that kind of viral video. Let's go.
Really hilarious. I'm going to open the window so the fire alarm doesn't go off. Like literally, I started it before we started our interview. And anyway.
Oh, that's fantastic. So tell me about you built a team that you trust, which is
it's a small team. And honestly, it's, it's just a couple of women and Valerie Floyd, who does our podcast stuff. She handles sort of like the podcast universe. So yeah, it's sort of a conglomeration. And, we post a lot less than we used to. That's just sort of a fact now. But yeah, I think that especially for the podcast, you want Addie, don't, no, my cat's going to run outside. This is really, I can't. Addie. Oh,
fantastic.
With the podcast, it's really the challenge of like drawing people in and teaching them about, it's about finding language that doesn't feel sensationalistic while also trying to capture attention. And that's like a really hard balance. And I think it's harder with the podcast because you really want people to tune in. And if you haven't heard of it, or maybe you'll like this if you didn't like that. So that language and that kind of stuff is a little bit more delicate. My personal stuff, we post a lot for the podcast. So that's kind of, I think, where a lot of the attention goes.
Can you share a story about going on the Howard Stern show or the Stephen Colbert show? Two of my favorite interviewers.
Colbert is,
I love a story from either one of them.
Yeah, look, Colbert is great. I got to go on Colbert. I've done a couple Colberts, and he's always just been really, really generous. I went on and got to talk about my book, and which I really appreciated. It's not something that he necessarily always does, like with people who are writing, science books for teenagers. But yeah, he was really terrific. Howard Stern is like, that's like a whole, I was terrified to go on Howard Stern. A lot of people say that's one of their favorite Howard Stern interviews is the one that we did. I didn't have a plan of like, here's how I'm going to act. But like, when he asked me gross things that I didn't want to answer, I just like didn't answer it. And it felt pretty easy. And He actually seemed kind of like a big softie. Like he was really cool.
That's awesome. Can you share about the books? Girling Up, Boring
Yeah,
Up?
I wrote, I mean, I have 4 books. I wrote a book about attachment parenting called Beyond the Sling. I wrote, the vegan cookbook, and then Boying Up and Girling Up. Those were both New York Times bestsellers. And those are about puberty, like the process of puberty from a neuroscience perspective, from a psychological perspective. Girling Up is more kind of obviously my experience, and Boying Up, we use the voices of people who actually went through male puberty throughout the book. But yeah, it's like the science of growing up. So they're really, really fun to do. And like I said, I'm a science communicator, so I love that stuff.
Do you plan on writing any more books?
I've thought about it, as our podcast focuses more on the intersection of science and spirituality. That's a field I think I would probably love to write about. So yeah, I might.
How was the live event experience with the show? Is that something you'd be interested in?
You mean like at South by?
Yeah.
Yeah, we loved it. Jonathan and I would actually love to speak more in that format. The audience really liked it. It was fun interacting with them. And I think also people have a lot of questions, I think we'd love to open that up to be able to do Q&A as part of the live podcast experience. So we had a great time.
Is there anything that you haven't done recently because of fear?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. Yeah, I had to have a hard work conversation on Friday that I had been putting off, and it actually went really well. Like it went really healthy, but I put it off for a long time because of fear.
I had a very difficult work conversation for our restaurant business a couple of weeks ago, and I too had been putting it off, and
how'd it go?
It went much better than expected.
There you go. See, we always imagine that it's going to be worse than it actually is.
And the restaurant it's still open and still going strong.
Good.
So, yeah, we're happy about that. Is there any kind of advice that you'd like to share with the hospitality community specifically? I mean, one of the things that I frequently share is my struggles. I'm in a program of recovery. I've been sober. I've been trying to do the things as a restaurant owner and bar owner that I didn't do when I was burning the candle at both ends. There's incredible resources. We'll put links into the show notes to some of the hospitality resources, but specifically to the restaurant owners and hospitality professionals that tune in our audience. Is there anything that that you can share with them?
I mean, look, COVID was exceptional, in so many ways. I actually was a partner in a really sweet little restaurant, a little vegan restaurant in downtown LA, and we didn't survive COVID, and I think, I think a lot of us got very comfortable, even more so ordering in and, using services like Instacart and all these things. And, that was a source of comfort for a lot of people. But I think what I'd like to acknowledge is that food did not come from nowhere. The people who were actually going to work and putting their lives at risk, that's how we got the ability, right, to order in and to get all this food that kept us sustained. And it's really important. And that business has, thrived tremendously. However, there's different kinds of frontline workers, and the people who were actually, again, people who were going to work, people who were working in kitchens, people who were making deliveries. Like that's actually how a huge component, of people's existence was. I raised my children to be very conscious of the people around them who are making things happen. And my older son recently said to me that, he says hi to everybody at his high school. He was homeschooled until 11th grade. And he's like, I say hi to everybody who works in the kitchen, and they act like people aren't usually saying hi to them. And I said, well, they may not always get people saying hi to them. So it's important, for us to acknowledge that it takes everybody, to make this go round. And we're still recovering from COVID. And for people who had to go in, and people in many cases who chose to go in, it's something to not take lightly. That is how a lot of this industry was asked, to keep the economy going in many cases.
Well, that is Mayim Bialik. You can find her, the Bialik Breakdown, on all podcast platforms. You can find her on YouTube. We'll put links to everything that she does. If you guys want to reach out to me, it's Shawn P. Walchef, ShawnPWalchef. I am grateful for your time. You've been
Thank you.
so gracious. Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing, not
Thank
just
you.
for our audience, but for sharing and being vulnerable, being a creator, someone as in the position that you are in. We believe in storytelling. My grandfather, he asked me to help him write his life story. We self-published
Wow.
a memoir. It's something that now we're helping other leaders, hospitality leaders and brands do, but everyone has a story, and you don't need to be a New York Times bestseller. Your story can make an impact on one boy in one village, one girl in one village, one girl in one city. That's all that matters.
Well, thank you. Thank you for what you do. So nice to talk to you.
So nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Restaurant Influencers. If you want to get in touch with me, I am weirdly available at Shawn P. Walchef, ShawnPWalchef. Cali Barbecue Media has other shows. You can check out Digital Hospitality. We've been doing that show since 2017. We also just launched a show, season 2, Family Style, on YouTube with Toast. And if you are a restaurant brand or a hospitality brand and you're looking to launch your own show, Cali Barbecue Media can help you. Recently, we just launched Room for Seconds with Greg Majewski. It is an incredible insight into leadership, into hospitality, into enterprise restaurants and franchisee relationships. Take a look at Room for Seconds. And if you're ready to start a show, reach out to us, betheshow.media. We can't wait to work with you.